Nom de Dieu, de putain de bordel de merde, de saloperie, de connard, d'enculé de ta mère. It's like wiping your ass with silk. I love it.
I am in no imaginable way a fan of religion. I think it's responsible for many of the greatest ills in the world, but the underlying problem with religions, and a lot of ideologies as well, is blind faith rather than necessarily the content itself. Without faith, you can examine stories and mythology, you can extract the good from amongst the bad, and so in this occasional video series I want to look at various religious, spiritual practices and ideologies and to attempt to extract the good that one can, so long as one doesn't treat it as true.
Take what you can. Give nothing back.
Christianity is a very widespread and adaptable religion, one that has mutated into a myriad of different forms with different traditions, different creeds, different practices and so on. It's proven itself to be rather mutable and adaptive in a way that other faiths, even from the same root, such as Judaism and Islam, haven't been. Of course, that sets people against each other as much as possible. But still, as such, it's not possible to talk about Christianity in any real unifying way, but one can look at Christianity in practice, or what Christians think it is, as a way to try and determine what useful elements are within Christianity. And of course, very few, if any, of these are exclusive to Christianity, but it can still provide an example we can work from to try and find these good aspects, these things we might be able to extract from it and use elsewhere, without all the baggage of mythology. The golden rule is found throughout history and throughout many different cultures, expressed in broadly the same way, but most of us today probably know it from Christianity as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, it's not foolproof, because you could say that if you were in such a situation you would want cruel treatment meted out against you, or you could say that if I were a criminal I would want to get away with it, things like this. It's not perfect by any means, but it does seem to express some deep sense of community and altruism within humanity. One of the earliest recorded expressions of this was found in ancient Egypt, somewhere in the late period of the Egyptian civilization as we know it, around 600 BCE or so. But it's well phrased in Christianity, it's graspable in Christianity, and in the best circumstances it does seem to inspire good Christians to do charitable works. Of course, you don't need a religion to do that. People tend to be charitable anyway, and weirdly the poorest amongst us are often the most charitable, and non-believers are incredibly charitable. If you offset for tithing within Christianity, you find that atheists are as or more generous than Christians, particularly when it comes to lending their time or their expertise for works. Still, Christianity expresses it well, and the Golden Rule is a good guide. How would I want someone to treat me? Would I want to be treated in this way? Putting yourself into the shoes of someone else, encouraging empathy, these are all good things. An obvious way to move on from that, from putting yourself in the shoes of someone else and how you're interacting with them, is the idea of what would Jesus do? And this is a bit trite, you find it on wristbands and things in certain mega churches and so on. But the idea is present elsewhere that Jesus, even though there's no evidence he ever existed, it presents this mythological figure, this example of supposed perfection. Just ignore what he actually does in the Bible, but this concept of perfection and something to be striven for. Christianity is unusual in that it acknowledges that that example is impossible to reach, but that one should still try. You don't need to apply that to Jesus. If you can pick a heroic figure, real or fictional, and compare and contrast your actions and what you're doing to what they would do, the things they accomplished, the things that they strive to do, that can be a powerful reinforcement of your conscience and a way to bend your behavior towards whatever ideal it is that you happen to hold. So this comparison is a useful idea, and it's more explicit in Christianity than a lot of other places. You wouldn't know it from the behavior of most Christians, but forgiveness is a big part of their creed. The idea that someone can and should be forgiven. This has led to all kinds of relatively positive things in our history. The idea of prison as being for reform rather than punishment has some roots in Christian ideology as well as socialistic thinking. And that's something that is missing in the world today, the idea that you can forgive someone of things that they've done rather than hold them over them for year after year after year. We don't acknowledge that people can change, repent, make reparations, whatever else. Instead, we hold them to account forever for even the slightest flaw. And social media has meant that those flaws are endlessly discoverable and spreadable. Game theory supports this idea of forgiveness. The winning strategy in the iterative prisoner's dilemma is to forgive a certain number of times and then to punish. Because people make mistakes, act in certain ways, and they will change those ways and act differently if you give them the opportunity. So there's something good to be found there. Of course, there's a negative side to this as well, as we've seen in the history of Christianity with the sale of indulgences and so on. But still, the idea of forgiveness, even if it's not so formal as the confessional, is something I think we could all do with taking on board a bit more. We do owe an unfortunate and a conditional debt to Christianity and to Islam for preserving a lot of the knowledge that was originally uncovered, disinterred from reality by the Greeks and the Romans. Christians preserved it in their monasteries. Islam preserved it to an extent up until the end of the Islamic Golden Age. But here we're concentrating on Christianity, and here it was held within the monasteries. If it hadn't been for that preservation of knowledge and the recapture of some through the Crusades, we would never have had the Renaissance. The Enlightenment and so on would have been delayed. Of course, this is a two-edged sword because they sat on a lot of this knowledge for a long time, hid a lot of it, kept it secret from people, didn't really allow it to come out so much. It was held within the ecclesiastical hierarchy for a very, very long time, longer than it needed to have been. And if you want a martyr for knowledge, Hypatia is probably a better one, considering she was murdered by Christians. The Alexandrian Library was burned down several times, but still, reluctantly, with all those reservations, I would acknowledge that the Christians, particularly in the monasteries, did preserve a lot of knowledge following the fall of the Roman Empire. And this idea of preservation of knowledge, of replication of knowledge, of the valuing of scholarship, even when it's problematic to your religion or ideology, that's something of value as well. And again, something I think we could do with remembering, particularly as so much of our knowledge gets transferred onto volatile media that's susceptible to electromagnetic attack or censorship increasingly. Weirdly, it might be better in a lot of ways to go back to paper as a way of preserving knowledge, because it can't be hacked, it can't be easily edited or changed, and you don't need a massive societal infrastructure to preserve written knowledge. So these are things worth remembering. A common thread throughout many religions, and one that's likely to come up time and time again throughout this series, is the emphasis on community and the ties that bind communities together through common ritual, common practice, regular gatherings, and so on. And this is something you can do without religions. You can meet according to hobby or ideology or fandom. But nothing else quite seems to stick in the way that religious community does. Now, some of this is because there's a big downside to the idea of community. It creates an enormous amount of peer pressure to get people to conform, to go along, to agree with, and the risk of being outcast by the community or shunned is always there. That's the cult-like downside of it. But if we can find secular ways to bring community together to common observance of particular ideals or marks of time as we move through the year that are meaningful in our new modern age, then that's something perhaps we should strive to. A lot of people who reject religion don't even like the idea of the term community. The skeptic community will make people bristle, the atheist community will make people bristle, because these things are like herding cats, and it acknowledges that we basically just share this one single idea or one or two ideas rather than a whole overarching philosophy. But a community is just people who do that, who share a common idea or ideology or a particular outlook. That's all it takes. You don't have to agree within a community. But if we can build a sense of community that doesn't make people bristle, that makes people bond together, but doesn't become a cult-like culture of mutual enforcement and a panopticon of that social enforcement and constantly rooting out heretics, which is what tends to happen in ideological echo chambers, then maybe we can get on to something good. Good things can happen for bad reasons, and good things can happen in a way that is extremely painful and destructive. The Reformation, Martin Luther's objections, the whole Protestant project, particularly at the extremes of the Protestant project even, was about the democratization of Christianity. It took the teachings of the church out of the hands of the priests, translated the Bible into the common tongue of various nations, and allowed even lay people to read, to study the Bible, and to move onwards. This is probably in large part to the assistance of atheism down the ages, because it made a lot of the flaws and issues in Christianity a lot more obvious as well. But this idea of the democratization of knowledge and the drive for literacy, which was in no small part driven by Protestantism, teaching people to read gave them access to wider knowledge than the Bible. Today we face a similar problem to the one that the Catholic Church faced with the Reformation coming along. A lot of the knowledge that is essential is unapproachable. A lot of the understanding of the world that is necessary about complicated issues like economics or climate change or the high ends of science, it's hard to make that graspable for the average layperson. And science communicators, powerful, good science communicators, like Dawkins, like Dennett, like Sagan, these are hard people to find, and the scientific community tends to look down on people who create popular science. With good reason to an extent. There are aspects of popular science that tends to lose what it's supposed to be about, and a lot of popular science as it appears in newspapers by article writers and so on is sensationalist and inaccurate. And the democratization that has happened of information and knowledge is itself problematic because a lot of it isn't properly rigorous. Not only the issue in popular science articles in newspapers and magazines, but if we search the internet, we are as or more likely to find cranks and outliers and crazy people with nonsensical ideas that appeal to the layperson, however bad the science is, but we're much less likely to find accurate science communicated in an effective way and prioritized within our searches and so on. And so we end up with this postmodernist muddle for a lot of people, even if they don't buy into postmodernism. This might seem like an odd one because it's evangelical zeal that has caused so much of the corruption, the death, the destruction, the ignorance around religions. But it's an inescapable fact that the most successful ideologies and religions proselytize. They seek out to find new members. They sell themselves on the best versions of themselves. And this is true whether you're talking about communism or Christianity or Islam. There are other smaller faiths and religions that persist down patrilineal or matrilineal lines, being raised into a tradition in a family. But the ones that really take on and shape the world more overtly are the ones that sell themselves. Now, it's annoying. It tends to lead to corruption and all the other problems I've already mentioned, but if you can find a way to find something to argue for, rather than the easier path perhaps of arguing against, then I think you have a better chance. This is where things like humanism and Brights and the abortive attempt of atheism plus and so on, they're on the right idea, but they're not finding the right way to go about it. I don't know what the right way to go about it is, but merely cult deprogramming people and taking a negative stance isn't a particularly effective or good way to spread positive ideas. Now, not all memes, not all memeplexes need to be as toxic and disastrous as religions have been. There are positive ideas that spread, typically through their utility. So if you can find a way to spread positive memetic organisms in a way that appeals to people, I think you're on to a winner. Zang.